So David's victory over Goliath was the result of his faith in and his respect for God, to whom he was connected as the Lord's anointed by Samuel with the oil in order to show he'd been chosen as king, but also verified by the anointing, the presence of the Holy Spirit. And it was God that David relied upon in order to accomplish what he did. The defeat of the Philistines, not just Goliath, but the entire army that was with him, was incredibly high for one as young as he was to climb. And it made it look like the sky was the limit. But we know that life has not just ups, it has downs. Those periods are never enjoyable. They can, however, be just as valuable if we respond to them right. If we understand that God refines the faith of his servants through the struggles that he allows them to endure, as he calls them to be faithful to him. We should be loyal through it all, and also, even in those times where maybe people are attacking us, we should love our enemies as God does. So for this today, we're going to be starting in 1 Samuel chapter 18. It's mentioned in your handout, so hopefully you're there in your Bibles, but if not, go ahead and take a moment to turn there or to grab a Bible from the table if you need one of those. In chapter 18, we're going to start at verse 1. It says that when he'd finished speaking to Saul, the soul of Jonathan was knit to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took David that day and would not let him go to his father's house anymore. Then Jonathan and David made a covenant because he loved him as his own soul, and Jonathan took off the robe that was on him and gave it to David, with his armor, even to his sword and his bow and his belt. So David went out wherever Saul sent him and behaved wisely. And Saul set him over the men of war, and he was accepted in the sight of all the people and also in the sight of Saul's servants. Now it happened as they were coming home, when David was returning from the slaughter of the Philistine, that the women had come out all the cities of Israel, singing and dancing to meet King Saul with tambourines, with joy, and with musical instruments. So the women sang as they danced and said, Saul has slain his thousands, and David his 10,000s. Then Saul was very angry, and the saying displeased him. And he said, they've ascribed to David 10,000s, and to me they've ascribed only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? So Saul eyed David from that day forward. And it happened on the next day that the distressing spirit from God came upon Saul, and he prophesied inside the house. So David played music with his hand, as at other times. But there was a spear in Saul's hand, and Saul cast the spear, for he said, I will pin David to the wall. But David escaped his presence twice. Now Saul was afraid of David, because the Lord was with him, but had departed from Saul. And therefore Saul removed him from his presence and made him his captain over 1,000. And he went out and came in before the people. And David behaved wisely in all his ways, and the Lord was with him. And therefore, when Saul saw that he behaved very wisely, he was afraid of him. But all Israel and Judah loved David, because he went out and came in before them. And we're going to be covering a lot of ground today, but this all boils down to what we just read here. It's just that Saul was jealous of David. It's incredibly petty. Just the point of comparison between him that these women are making in this psalm, and he starts to hate David as a result of it. But it's not just petty. The thing that we always want to remember about Saul is whatever else, he was incredibly clever. And he's on the lookout. He's already, just in defeating Goliath, David, even though he was a youth, had gone out and done what Saul was really supposed to. He was the king. But it's this young kid who steps up to the plate. And Saul's thinking about that, and now he's thinking about the praise that he's receiving, and he's remembering that the Lord has sworn to take the kingdom from him and give it to another man. Saul has correctly identified David as his chief rival. And that's why he's angry. But of course, there's an additional element that's fueling his paranoia here. I mentioned in passing last week that when the Lord abandoned Saul, he didn't just leave him alone, he actually sent a tormenting spirit to trouble the king. And that was actually how David and Saul were introduced. David was a very skilled musician. He went to play for Saul in order to be a calming presence for him, It actually kind of presents an irony to this situation, because if David had not defeated Goliath, then he would have just been probably very comfortable as a court musician for years and gone completely without being noticed. He would have remained safely obscure. It was actually defeating Goliath that put him in the crosshairs here. And he is playing for Saul still, without realizing the king's rising fury even as it's aimed at him. Now, we can wonder, of course, why it says that this happened twice, why David stuck around for the possibility of a second throw. But remember, he's playing because he knows that Saul is spiritually oppressed. His outbursts were common anyway. They would have made him angry, crazy. And that was what Saul was counting on. He's using his mania as an excuse for his murderous intent. But yet more irony in this, it actually left Saul as the one who was afraid, because he missed from point-blank range twice. David was protected, which just further motivated Saul to be rid of him. Now, of course, not everybody in Saul's family felt the same way. We read about Jonathan and how high of an opinion he had of David. That was also shared by Saul's daughter, Michal. But Saul thought that he could use that against David too. So this is what we find now at verse 20. It says that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved David. And they told Saul, and the thing pleased him. So Saul said, I'll give her to him, that she may be a snare to him, and that the hand of the Philistines may be against him. And therefore Saul said to David a second time, You shall be my son-in-law today. And Saul commanded his servants, Communicate with David secretly, and say, Look, the king has delight in you, and all his servants love you. Now, therefore, become the king's son-in-law. So Saul's servants spoke these words in the hearing of David, and David said, Does it seem like a light thing to you to be the king's son-in-law, seeing I'm a poor and lightly esteemed man? And the servants of Saul told him, saying, In this manner David spoke. And then Saul said, Thus you shall say to David, The king does not desire any dowry, except for 100 foreskins of the Philistines, to take vengeance on the king's enemies. But Saul thought to make David fall by the hand of the Philistines. So when his servants told David these words, it pleased David well to become the king's son-in-law. Now the days had not expired, and therefore David arose and went, he and his men, and killed 200 men of the Philistines. And David brought their foreskins, and they gave them in full count to the king, that he might become the king's son-in-law. And then Saul gave him Michal, his daughter, as wife. Thus Saul saw and knew that the Lord was with David, and that Michal, Saul's daughter, loved him. And Saul was still more afraid of David. So Saul became David's enemy continually. Then the princes of the Philistines went out to war, and so it was, whenever they went out, that David behaved more wisely than all the servants of Saul, so that his name became highly esteemed. So again, should never doubt the shrewdness of Saul. He heard that his daughter had a crush and saw it as an opportunity, offering David the chance to join the royal family, which, like we saw there, was actually the second time that he had done that. And you maybe remember from last time, it was supposed to be the reward for killing Goliath, but Saul had reneged on that. And it was actually supposed to be his older daughter that was married to David. He backed out of the deal, so now he's presenting it again. That might even be part of the reason why David kind of turns it down to begin with. It was humility, clearly. That's what he refers to. He just doesn't see himself as worthy of being part of Saul's household. But it may also have been, well, he didn't mean it the first time, so why should I believe that he means it now? But Saul correctly guesses that David will not be able to turn down a challenge. And his hope was that he could therefore send him on a suicide mission. That's the goal of this. So the Philistines could solve his problem for him and let him pretend that his hands were clean, but the Lord is with David. So the plan backfires spectacularly as David and his small band lead a lightning raid and were able to double the number of enemies that Saul had intended as an unrealistic target, making David even more famous among all the people than he'd been before, and increasing Saul's own daughter, Michal's, love for him, considering what a display of desire and devotion it was. Nothing's going right for Saul in his attempts to create an unfortunate accident. So he just drops the mask entirely. This is what we find next in chapter 19, now at verse 11. It says, Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him and to kill him in the morning. And Michal, David's wife, told him, saying, if you do not save your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he went and fled and escaped. And Michal took an image and laid it in the bed, put a cover of goat's hair for his head, and covered it with clothes. So when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, he's sick. Then Saul sent the messengers back to see David, saying, bring him up to me in the bed that I may kill him. When the messengers had come in, there was the image in the bed with a cover of goat's hair for his head. And then Saul said to Michal, why have you deceived me like this and sent my enemy away so that he has escaped? And Michal answered Saul, he said to me, let me go. Why should I kill you? So David fled and escaped and went to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and stayed in Naioth. Now, even before this, Saul had actually tried to get Jonathan to kill David. He knew that they were friends and thought maybe he could take advantage of that. It was because he couldn't fathom how much of a better man his son was than his, really. How humble and how loyal Jonathan was. Saul's only thought is, well, he's as much a threat to you as he is to me. Jonathan, though, he warned David and he worked to reconcile both men. All that actually did, though, even though Saul basically pretended that things were back to normal, it just taught him not to include his son in his plans anymore. Somehow, though, Michal figured them out, and she came up with a plan of her own, helping David to escape in the dead of night and buying him a bit of additional time by claiming he was sick and putting a wig on a lump under the covers in case anybody happened to basically look through the window. And then she protected herself from her father by saying that she had done all of this under duress, that David had threatened her, and that was why she had to play along. And it worked in the moment, but just keep Michal in the back of your minds as we move forward over the next few weeks, because she is going to come back up, and this did unfortunately have lasting consequences for her. But this moment, David, he escapes to Samuel, and then he reached out to Jonathan for more help, who in the end just had to help him run away, because Saul was totally devoted to killing him. So first, David ran to the high priest Ahimelech. And under the strain of his situation, he did something unfortunate. He lied to the priest and told him that he was on a secret mission from the king and requested supplies to carry it out. Some bread from the tabernacle service and also the sword of Goliath. The reason why he lied was because he didn't know if he could trust Ahimelech. He didn't know if maybe he would, hold him and turn him over to the king, or at least inform the king what direction he was going. And to be fair, it seems like David wanted to be able to offer the priest some plausible deniability. That if they were questioned about it, that they could say, well, he just said he was working for the king. And so that was kind of what David's thought process appears to have been. It would have ultimately been better if he just told the truth and allowed the priest to make an informed decision, and it didn't help that Saul actually had somebody who was an informant who was present at the time. But after that, David's fear led him to make an even stranger choice, quite frankly, because he fled to Gath. And if that name sounds familiar, that's because it was the hometown of Goliath. That was where David decided he would be safe, apparently figuring that the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And there's something to that. It's actually going to come up later in his story as well. But the Philistines are absolutely not inclined to see it that way in this moment, and they plan to kill him. So David, in an effort to try to protect himself, he decided to pretend to be insane. And that was a little bit of a risk. The reason why it would work at all is because people in the ancient world thought that those with psychological disorders were touched by the gods, and that there was some type of spiritual component in what they were experiencing. And the line does seem to be fine. That's even what was happening with Saul, which we know, what is described to us here. And so that is what he's essentially banking on, but they could have potentially seen through it because he's lying, or they could have, even if they decided not to kill him as a result, they might have imprisoned him. They might have kept him there for the rest of his life. Instead, they basically reacted by saying, well, we have enough crazy people, and they kicked them out of town. And so David properly saw that as God was providing for him, was giving him what he needed in order to get away, to protect him. And so because of that, David started to essentially calm down. He remembered that his life was in God's hands, so he went back home, back into Israel, and started gathering allies to himself. Now, put him in the unfortunate position that even though he'd been totally loyal to Saul, he was now essentially a rebel, leading a military force of his own in opposition to the king, because these were other people who were also disaffected under Saul's reign. David's in a position where he essentially has no choice. Saul, meanwhile, was working actively to hunt him down. And the next stage of that is what we find now in chapter 22 at verse 6. It says, when Saul heard that David and the men who were with him had been discovered, now Saul was staying in Gibeah under a tamarisk tree in Ramah with his spear in his hand and all his servants standing about him. Then Saul said to his servants who stood about him, hear now, you Benjamites, will the son of Jesse give every one of you fields and vineyards and make you all captains of thousands and captains of hundreds? All you have conspired against me. There's no one who reveals to me that my son has made a covenant with the son of Jesse. There's not one of you who is sorry for me or reveals to me that my son has stirred up my servant against me to lie in wait as it is this day. Then answered Doeg the Edomite, who was set over the servants of Saul, and said, I saw the son of Jesse going to Nob, to Ahimelech the son of Ahitub. And he inquired of the Lord for him, and gave him provisions, and gave him the sword of Goliath the Philistine. So the king sent to call Ahimelech the priest, the son of Ahitub, and all his father's house, the priests who were in Nob. And they all came to the king, and Saul said, hear now, son of Ahitub. And he answered, here I am, my lord. Then Saul said to him, why have you conspired against me, you and the son of Jesse, in that you've given him bread and a sword, and have inquired of God for him, that he should rise against me to lie in wait as it is this day? So Ahimelech answered the king and said, who among all your servants is as faithful as David, who's the king's son-in-law, who goes at your bidding and is honorable in your house? And did I then begin to inquire of God for him? Far be it from me. Let not the king impute anything to his servant or to anyone in the house of my father, for your servant knew nothing of all this, little or much. And the king said, you shall surely die, Ahimelech, you and all your father's house. Then the king said to the guards who stood about him, turn and kill the priests of the Lord, because their hand also is with David, and because they knew when he fled and did not tell it to me. But the servants of the king would not lift their hands to strike the priests of the Lord. And the king said to Doeg, you turn and kill the priests. So Doeg the Edomite turned and struck the priests, and killed on that day 85 men who wore a linen ephod. Also Nob, the city of the priests, he struck with the edge of the sword both men and women, children and nursing infants, oxen and donkeys and sheep with the edge of the sword. Now one of the sons of Ahimelech, the son of Ahitub, named Abiathar, escaped and fled after David. And Abiathar told David that Saul had killed the Lord's priests. So David said to Abiathar, I knew that day when Doeg the Edomite was there that he would surely tell Saul, I've caused the death of all the persons of your father's house. Stay with me, do not fear, for he who seeks my life seeks your life, but with me you shall be safe. This is one of, if it is not the greatest of Saul's crimes. His paranoia and madness led him to see everyone around him as traitors, starting with his own people, members of his own tribe who he said were working with his own son in order to cast him down. And then also leading to the priests who hadn't done anything except feed David in good faith that he was working for the king. He had them killed for it, killed by a foreigner, because even his closest followers refused to join in and had them, or attempted to have them, killed down to the very last, unlike he had done to the Amalekites, who were actually supposed to be his enemies. So this is insane. But it isn't just insane. Once again, Saul's doing this with purpose. There's a strategy in mind. He knew how much the people loved David. Saul wanted them to be more afraid of him, so that whenever they heard where David was, that they wouldn't support him, that they would inform on him instead, that they would think, well, if Saul killed all the priests, what will he do to us if he finds out we knew where David was? And on this front, Saul was at least partly successful. David was constantly being informed on by the people that he was staying with. But there was also a very personal goal in mind with this. The priests, they had been anointed by the Lord to be in his service. That was part of how they were inaugurated. And so, Saul is really pursuing a catharsis here, you could say. He's attacking the priests because he can't reach God. That's who he's really angry at, because he believed the Lord had betrayed him too, refusing to acknowledge that he had brought this on himself. So he's making it the Lord's problem instead. But that never works. The Lord's purposes can't be stopped, and he can't be harmed by anyone. In fact, he was even using Saul in this. Now, it doesn't excuse the king, but Ahimelech, his family, they were in the line of Eli. This was the curse against him, bearing fruit, being realized once more. For another thing, though, the Lord also provided for one of these priests to escape and to make his way to David, who now, as a result of all of this, would at least have the priesthood completely on his side. The religious authority, hugely influential in Israel, was going to support him. Now, for his part, David apologized to Abiathar. And like we were saying, he does bear some of the blame in this, I think you can fairly say. If he had told the truth, then Ahimelech and the others would, at the very least, they wouldn't have been blindsided. They would have been able to decide if they wanted to help David or not, and if they did, then they would have been able to come up with some type of plan when talking to Saul, instead of just being caught totally off guard here like they were. But that fault of David's, if we can call it that, is one piece of straw on top of the heavy burden of guilt that is Saul's. He created this situation. It is his fault. It would come back to bite him. And David actually got the chance to make that happen. Throughout all of chapter 23, there's like this game of cat and mouse that goes on, where David and his band of merry men, I guess, it's growing, and it's moving from one hiding place to another because they're frequently being betrayed, just like Saul wanted, and they're forced to move. And they're never more than a half step in front of Saul until finally being cornered. And this is what we find in chapter 24 at verse 1. It says, "It happened when Saul had returned from following the Philistines that it was told him, saying, 'Take note, David is in the wilderness of En-Gedi.' Then Saul took 3,000 chosen men from all Israel and went to seek David and his men on the rocks of the wild goats. So he came to the sheepfolds by the road where there was a cave, and Saul went in to attend to his needs. David and his men were staying in the recesses of that cave. Then the men of David said to him, 'This is the day of which the Lord said to you, Behold, I will deliver your enemy into your hand, that you may do to him as seems good to you.' And David arose and secretly cut off a corner of Saul's robe. Now it happened afterward that David's heart troubled him because he had cut Saul's robe. And he said to his men, 'The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my master, the Lord's anointed, to stretch out my hand against him, seeing he is the anointed of the Lord.' So David restrained his servants with these words and did not allow them to rise up against Saul. And Saul got up from the cave and went on his way. David also arose afterward and went out of the cave and called out to Saul, saying, 'My lord the king.' And when Saul looked behind him, David stooped with his face to the earth and bowed down. And David said to Saul, 'Why do you listen to the words of men who say, Indeed, David seeks your harm? Look, this day your eyes have seen that the Lord delivered you today into my hand in the cave, and someone urged me to kill you, but my eye spared you. And I said, I will not stretch out my hand against my Lord, for he is the Lord's anointed. Moreover, my father, see the corner of your robe in my hand. For in that I cut off the corner of your robe and did not kill you, know and see that there is neither evil nor rebellion in my hand, and I have not sinned against you. Yet you hunt my life to take it. Let the Lord judge between you and me, and let the Lord avenge me on you. But my hand shall not be against you. As the proverb of the ancients says, wickedness proceeds from the wicked, but my hand shall not be against you. After whom has the king of Israel come out? Whom do you pursue? A dead dog? A flea? Therefore let the Lord be judge, and judge between you and me, and see and plead my case, and deliver me out of your hand. So it was, when David had finished speaking these words to Saul, that Saul said, Is this your voice, my son David? And Saul lifted up his voice and wept. And then he said to David, You are more righteous than I, for you have rewarded me with good, whereas I have rewarded you with evil. And you have shown this day how you have dealt well with me. For when the Lord delivered me into your hand, you did not kill me. For if a man finds his enemy, will he let him go away safely? Therefore may the Lord reward you with good for what you have done to me this day. And now I know indeed that you shall surely be king, and that the kingdom of Israel shall be established in your hand. Therefore swear now to me by the Lord that you will not cut off my descendants after me, and that you will not destroy my name from my father's house. So David swore to Saul. And Saul went home, but David and his men went up to the stronghold. And then Samuel died. And the Israelites gathered together and lamented for him and buried him at his home in Ramah. And David arose and went down to the wilderness of Paran. So yes, Saul cornered David at the start there, but without realizing it. Went into a cave to use the bathroom, essentially, without knowing that David was there, and the tables were suddenly turned. David's men were ecstatic. They saw it as God's providence. It was as clear as if he had spoken to them, although he actually hadn't. This is not a recorded prophecy. This is just them speaking for God. And so David saw things differently. He agreed the Lord was at work, but he also knew that God had chosen the king. And that's an important point that we can even apply today, and understanding that there are situations where we can see God as at work, but we need to refer to what he has actually already revealed in Scripture in order to know what to make of those moments and opportunities. So David here, he's referring to the fact that Saul was anointed, just like Ahimelech and the priests had been, just like David himself had been. And so no matter how far fallen he was, David would not do to Saul what Saul had done to those priests, because he did understand what it would mean, that would be lashing out against the Lord. It would ultimately be an attempt to attack him, what Saul had done. Yet another reason why he was in so much trouble. David won't do that. He won't take the throne by force because he trusted he would receive it in God's timing. So instead, he just took proof of what he could have done, that piece of the robe. And when he showed it to Saul, the king actually acknowledged David's righteousness. It's a rare moment of lucidity and contrition that I believe is genuine. Now, it wasn't permanent. It didn't last for very long, but I do think he actually meant it, at least in this moment, just because he left. He went home. That was his opportunity. He could have killed David right then and there, but he didn't. He is actually acknowledging that David is in the right. And David, once more, he'd spoken and acted with humility and with loyalty. Saul also, though, is ready to admit David's not going to stay in a lowly place. What's clear to everyone is also clear to him. The Lord would, in the end, make David king. Now, the thing about history, when we read stories like this, is that, of course, the details are specific to the people that it describes. But it's been said, and I think true enough, that even if history doesn't repeat itself, it very often rhymes. And there are aspects of David's difficulties with Saul that we need to know how to apply to our own lives. Like understanding, again, that if God has revealed something, then some circumstance in our lives is not going to overwrite that. We always have to refer to His truth first and foremost. One of the other things we see here, though, is that life lived in God's service is not easy. It doesn't always go the way that we want it to, and a lot of times, actually, the biggest challenges follow the biggest successes. The successes actually tend to create the challenges. That was what happened to David. It was defeating Goliath that actually made him Saul's enemy through no fault of his own. But when we run into those situations, the best thing for us to do is to see them as opportunities. To know that God is watching over us, even if we are going through a struggle, and He's given us His guidance in His Word, through His Spirit. So we have to decide how to respond. We don't want it to be like Saul, who very shrewdly, very cleverly, played for every human advantage to disobey the Lord and wound up tormented as a result and lashing out at God for what was his own fault. So many people do that. It's not leading anywhere good for them. We want to be like David, to admit how small we are, a dead dog, a flea, not worthy to join the family, that it's not in our power. We need the Lord. And we can trust in Him that He will provide justice. He will see us through. That is our reason to be faithful, to be loyal to Him above everything else. And how can we know that this is true? Well, in part, it's because David's life provides some evidence of that. But it's not just his experience, it's because he's pointing to an even greater experience. These things that happen in him, the short version of this story, we should be able to recognize another story in it. You have David, who is treated as a rebel in spite of being totally loyal. He suffered unjustly, not deserved, and when he had the chance to strike back, he refused because he believed that God would vindicate him and give him the throne. Who are we talking about? This is Jesus. This is His story. He was also hated without a cause and accused of crimes He did not commit. He was perfectly innocent. And He could have saved Himself in that moment, could have destroyed all of His enemies with a word. But instead He bore their sins, suffering for all of us, in taking on our death on the cross. And He did that because He believed the Father would vindicate Him, which He did by raising Him from the dead. And Christ ascended to heaven, where He sits on the Father's throne, reigning over all creation. That was the deliverance that David foreshadowed. And of course, not this is the deliverance for Christ, ours. That's where salvation is from. That is what we have to depend upon. Whatever happens in times of testing and suffering and sorrow, it can actually make us stronger. It can refine our hearts when we know we are redeemed in Jesus. Now, for anybody who is not yet redeemed in Jesus, you may not want to see yourself as the Saul of your story. But if you're not a Christian, you're not really very far removed from that. Don't continue to follow in his self-destructive footsteps. You have to admit that God is more righteous than you. And you need to ask for His forgiveness and trust that it's actually provided for. That was what Jesus did in His resurrection. The world pretends to offer so many answers, so many paths, but every one of them is just a mad hunt for meaning that will always escape you. The only way to find it is by asking God for it. So, is there anybody who's ready to do that today? Here, online, to actually respond and to pray to God for His forgiveness, for the gift of the Holy Spirit, for the promise of eternal life? If you are, then just do so. If you're here and you want to step forward to be able to have that conversation, I'll stand aside during the song for communion and can actually do that. But you can do that from where you are, and I hope you won't let anything hold you back any longer, if that's a decision you have to make. But for those of us who are Christians, the thing for us to take away from this is that, there's going to be times in life where you feel like prey, where you feel like you are being hunted, where you feel like you are being treated unfairly. Don't respond to those moments like wild animals. Don't be seeking to get revenge against your enemies or to lash out against the Lord. Show those people who are maybe causing you that harm their error instead, like David did with Saul, in the hope that they might give up the pursuit of evil and be able to find their own salvation instead. But whether they do or not, you can't control their reaction. You control yours. Trust the Lord through whatever you face, and know that the Almighty King will deliver you.